You're fired. Leave now." The words cut through the quiet hum of the Beverly Hills afternoon as Emily Carter stood frozen beside the infinity pool, her fingers tightening instinctively over the gentle curve of her 6-month belly, sunlight dancing across the water behind her like a life she had only ever been allowed to clean, never live. While Alexander Reed didn't even bother to look up from his phone, his voice calm, controlled, and completely indifferent, as if dismissing her was no more significant than canceling a meeting. And for a second, Emily thought she might say something, explain, beg even, but she swallowed it down because she had learned long ago that men like him didn't listen, especially not to women like her, and instead she nodded faintly, blinking back the sting in her eyes as she turned toward the long marble walkway that led out of the estate, her worn sneakers whispering against the polished floor, each step heavier than the last, until a voice behind her hesitated, uncertain. "Sir, are you sure?" And for the first time, Alexander's thumb paused mid-scroll, his sharp gaze lifting slightly, irritation flickering across his face as the house manager stepped closer, lowering his voice. "There's something you should know about her." But Emily kept walking, faster now, as if she could outrun whatever truth was about to catch up, her heart pounding not just from fear of losing her job, but from the deeper, more dangerous fear that staying any longer might unravel everything she had worked so hard to keep hidden, because this house, this man, this place, it wasn't just another job, and she had known that from the moment she first stepped through those gates 2 months ago, when she recognized the exact layout of the garden before anyone showed her around, when she instinctively knew the code to the side entrance before being told, when the scent of the ocean drifting up from the cliffs triggered memories she had buried so deeply she convinced herself they never existed. And yet she stayed, telling herself it was just coincidence, just survival, just a paycheck to prepare for the baby growing inside her. But now, as she reached the edge of the driveway, her vision blurring, she heard footsteps behind her, firm and deliberate, and then his voice again, colder this time, sharper, "Wait," and she froze despite herself, every instinct screaming at her to keep going, not to turn back, not to let him see her face again. But slowly, reluctantly, she turned, meeting the piercing gray eyes of Alexander Reed for the first time that day, and something in his expression had shifted, just slightly, as if he were seeing her not as an employee, but as a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit, his gaze flicking briefly to her stomach, then back to her eyes, searching, calculating, and for a split second, something unfamiliar crossed his face, something dangerously close to recognition, but it vanished as quickly as it came, replaced by the same guarded composure he wore like armor. "What's your full name?" he asked, his tone deceptively casual, and Emily's breath caught because that question, simple as it sounded, was the one thing she had been avoiding since the day she arrived, the one truth that could change everything. And she hesitated just long enough for the silence to stretch, for the tension to thicken in the warm California air, before she finally answered, her voice barely above a whisper. "Emily Carter." And the moment the words left her lips, she knew it wasn't enough, because the way his eyes narrowed, the way his jaw tightened, told her he didn't believe her, not completely, not anymore. And somewhere deep in his memory, something was starting to surface, something tied to a different name, a different woman, a different night he had never fully forgotten. And as Emily turned away again, forcing herself to keep walking, Alexander Reed stood there, watching her leave, unaware that he had just let go of the one woman whose truth could shatter everything he thought he knew. The moment Emily stepped beyond the iron gates, the world felt different, heavier, like the air itself was pressing against her chest as she forced herself not to look back, not to second-guess the one decision she knew she could not undo, because staying would have been worse than leaving. Staying meant risking everything she had protected for years, and yet each step down the quiet palm-lined street felt slower than the last, her hand still resting protectively over her stomach as if she could shield the life inside her from the consequences already unfolding behind her. While back at the estate, Alexander Reed remained exactly where she left him, his eyes fixed on the empty driveway long after she disappeared from view, a strange, persistent tension settling in his chest that he could not immediately explain, because firing employees was routine for him, necessary even, He built his empire on precision, control, and zero tolerance for unpredictability, and Emily Carter had become unpredictable. But as he replayed the brief exchange in his mind, something did not align. Something about the way she hesitated before saying her name. Something about the way she looked at him, not with fear alone, but with something deeper, something almost familiar. And that single thought irritated him more than anything else. Because Alexander Reed did not believe in coincidences, he believed in facts, in records, in data that could be verified and controlled. So without another word, he turned sharply and walked back into the house. His pace quick, decisive, heading straight for his office where walls of glass overlooked the endless stretch of ocean below. The same view he had seen every day for years, yet now felt oddly unfamiliar. Like a memory he could not fully reach. And within seconds he was on his computer, pulling up employee files, scanning through the temporary staff list until her name appeared. Emily Carter, recently hired. Minimal background, no detailed history. And that alone was enough to deepen the crease in his brow, because nothing in his world was ever minimal, especially not someone who had somehow gained access to restricted areas of his home without triggering a single alert. And as he leaned back slightly, his fingers tapping once against the desk, a flicker of something resurfaced. Not a clear image, not yet, just a fragment, a voice from years ago, softer, warmer, calling his name in a way no one had in a very long time. And suddenly the memory shifted to that night he rarely allowed himself to revisit, a night by the ocean, the sound of waves crashing against the cliffs, a woman standing beside him under the dim glow of outdoor lights. Her face blurred in his recollection, but her presence unmistakable, and the feeling, that feeling of something real, something he had dismissed as temporary, insignificant, until it disappeared without explanation, leaving behind nothing but questions he chose to ignore. But now those questions were no longer quiet, they were rising, demanding attention, because the way Emily Carter had looked at him, the way she moved through his house as if she belonged there long before she was hired, it was not normal, it was not random, and for the first time in years Alexander felt something dangerously close to uncertainty, and he did not like it, not at all. So he reached for his phone and made a single call, his voice low and controlled as he spoke, instructing his head of security to run a full background check, not the standard 1, a complete investigation, every record, every alias, every trace they could find. Because if there was one thing he trusted more than instinct, it was information. And yet, even as he ended the call, his gaze drifted back toward the gates in the distance, the place where she had walked away without looking back, and an unfamiliar thought settled in his mind, quiet but persistent. What if letting her go had been a mistake? Not a small one, but the kind that could not be undone, the kind that changed everything once the truth finally surfaced. By the time the sun began to dip toward the Pacific, casting long golden shadows across the city, Emily Carter had already walked nearly half a mile from the estate, her pace slower now as the weight of exhaustion caught up with her, not just physical but emotional, the kind that settled deep in her chest and refused to lift, because losing the job was only part of it. What truly unsettled her was the way Alexander Reed had looked at her in those final seconds, like he was beginning to see through something she had carefully constructed, something she had spent years making sure would never surface again. And as she reached a quiet bus stop at the corner of a wide boulevard, she lowered herself onto the bench with a soft exhale, one hand gripping the edge for support while the other remained over her stomach, feeling the faint movement inside, as if the baby sensed her unease. And she closed her eyes briefly, whispering under her breath that everything would be fine, even though she was no longer sure that was true, because coming to Los Angeles had never been part of her original plan. Returning to this city, to this exact place, had been something she avoided for as long as she could, until circumstances left her with no other option. And even then she told herself it would only be temporary, just long enough to save enough money to start over somewhere far away, somewhere safe. But fate had a way of pulling her back to the very person she needed to stay hidden from. And now that he had seen her, really seen her, there was no guarantee she could disappear again. Not this time. While across the city inside the glass walls of his office, Alexander Reed stood motionless as the first report began to come in faster than expected, his security team efficient as always, but the information on his screen only deepened the unease building inside him. because there was almost nothing there. No substantial employment history, no consistent address records, no family connections listed in any official database. As if Emily Carter had simply appeared out of nowhere. And that was not possible, not in his world, not in a country where every detail left a trace. And as he scrolled further, his jaw tightened when a small note appeared, flagged by one of his analysts, indicating that the name Emily Carter had only been active in records for a few years. Prior to that, there was nothing, no digital footprint, no identification trail. And that single detail shifted something in his mind, because it confirmed what he had already begun to suspect, that the name she gave him was not her real name. And suddenly the memory that had been hovering just out of reach began to sharpen, not fully clear but stronger now. The outline of a woman standing by the ocean years ago, her hair caught in the wind, her voice steady yet soft as she spoke words he had not thought about in a long time. Words about leaving, about choices, about consequences that he had dismissed in the moment because he believed he controlled everything, including people, including outcomes. And yet she had walked away from him without asking for anything, without trying to stay, and that had unsettled him more than he ever admitted, because no one walked away from Alexander Reed, not without reason. And now as he stared at the incomplete file on his screen, a realization settled in slowly but firmly. The woman he had just fired was not a stranger. She was connected to that memory, to that night, to that unanswered question he had buried. And if that was true, then her presence in his house was not an accident, which meant her leaving was not something he could ignore. And for the first time in years, Alexander did something impulsive, something driven not by logic, but by instinct. He grabbed his keys and headed out without another word, his mind fixed on one thought that refused to fade. He needed to find her before she disappeared again, because this time, losing her might mean losing the truth he had unknowingly been searching for all along. The engine of Alexander Reed's car roared to life as he pulled out of the driveway faster than he normally would, the gates opening automatically behind him while his mind replayed every second of the past hour, each detail sharper now, more urgent, as if something inside him refused to let this go, because this was no longer about a terminated employee. This was about a missing piece of a memory he had ignored for years. And as he drove down the winding roads of Beverly Hills, his grip tightening slightly on the steering wheel, he realized he did not even know where to begin looking. Los Angeles was vast, endless, and yet he knew she could not have gone far, not in her condition, not with the way she had been walking, slow, careful, protective. And that image alone unsettled him more than he expected, because it forced a question into his mind that he had not allowed himself to consider before. Whose child was she carrying? And for a brief second he dismissed it, telling himself it was irrelevant, none of his concern. But the thought did not leave. It lingered, pressing against the edges of his logic, because something about the timing, about her presence in his life now after so many years, did not feel random. And meanwhile, just a few miles away, Emily Carter sat on the bus, her gaze fixed on the passing streets outside the window, the city moving around her in a blur of lights and shadows as the reality of what had just happened slowly settled in. Her job was gone, her plan was gone, and worse than that, the one person she had spent years avoiding was now closer to the truth than ever before. And she knew Alexander Reed well enough to understand that once he started asking questions, he would not stop until he found answers. That was who he was, relentless, precise, incapable of letting something remain unsolved. And that meant she did not have much time, not anymore. So as the bus came to a stop near a modest neighborhood far from the polished streets of the estate, she stood carefully, steadying herself before stepping down onto the sidewalk, her eyes scanning the quiet block lined with small apartment buildings. Nothing like the world she had just left behind. But it was all she had for now. And as she walked toward the narrow entrance of a worn building, she reached into her bag and pulled out a small envelope, the edges slightly bent from being carried for so long. Inside it was the only thing she had kept from the past, the only proof of a night that had changed everything. And for a moment she hesitated, her fingers brushing against the paper as memories threatened to surface. Memories of the ocean air, of a conversation she had not been able to forget, of a man who had looked at her not as a stranger, but as someone he believed he understood, until everything fell apart, and she closed her eyes briefly. taking a steady breath before tucking the envelope back into her bag, because now was not the time to dwell on the past. Now was the time to disappear, to protect the future she was carrying. But across the city, Alexander had already begun to close the distance, his car moving through traffic with focused urgency as a new update came through his phone, a location ping from a nearby transit stop where Emily's image had been captured by a street camera, and his eyes narrowed slightly as he adjusted his route without hesitation, because now he had direction, and with direction came certainty. And as the distance between them grew smaller with each passing minute, neither of them realized just how close they were to crossing paths again, and how that moment, when it came, would change everything they thought they knew. The moment Emily stepped inside the narrow apartment building, she felt the weight of the outside world press against the door as it shut behind her, like she had crossed into a temporary refuge that could disappear at any second. The dim hallway stretching ahead with flickering lights and worn carpet that softened her footsteps as she moved carefully toward the stairs, avoiding the elevator because she did not want to be seen. Not tonight. Not when every instinct inside her was telling her that time was running out. And as she climbed slowly to the second floor, her breathing steady but controlled, she reached her unit and unlocked the door with a small metallic click, immediately stepping inside and locking it behind her before leaning back against it, her eyes closing for a brief moment as silence wrapped around her. But it was not peace. It was the kind of silence that made every thought louder, every memory sharper. And as she moved further into the small space, placing her bag gently on the table, she pulled out the envelope again, this time holding it longer, her fingers tracing the edges as if grounding herself in something real, something undeniable, because inside that envelope was the truth she had hidden from Alexander Reed, the truth that could connect everything. And as she slowly opened it, revealing a single photograph slightly faded with time, her breath caught as she looked at it. The image capturing a moment by the ocean years ago, the two of them, standing closer than strangers ever would, his expression softer than she had ever seen it again, her own smile unguarded, unaware of how quickly everything would change. And beneath the photograph was a folded document, one she had never shown anyone, not even once, because it carried a name, a real name, one that did not belong to Emily Carter. And that name was tied to a past Alexander had never fully understood, a past she had been forced to leave behind. And as her hand instinctively moved to her stomach, a quiet realization settled in again. This was no longer just about her. It was about the life she was responsible for now, the future she had to protect at all costs, even if that meant disappearing completely, leaving behind every unanswered question, every unresolved connection. Because Alexander Reed did not lose things, he found them. And if he found her truth, there was no telling what it would change, not just for him, but for the child she carried. And meanwhile, just a few blocks away, Alexander's car slowed as he approached the area flagged by his security team, his sharp eyes scanning the streets with calculated focus, taking in every detail, the modest buildings, the quiet sidewalks, the absence of the luxury he was accustomed to. And something about that contrast unsettled him again, because it did not match the fragments of memory forming in his mind. The woman he remembered did not belong in a place like this. She had carried herself differently, with a quiet confidence that did not need wealth to exist. And as he parked near the corner, stepping out of the car, his presence alone seemed out of place in the neighborhood, but he did not hesitate, his attention fixed on the building ahead where the last confirmed sighting had been recorded. And as he moved closer, each step deliberate, the distance between past and present narrowing with every second, he had no way of knowing that just beyond those walls, Emily stood holding the one piece of truth that could change everything, and that their paths, once separated by years of silence and unanswered questions, were now closer to colliding than ever before. Emily stood motionless in the center of the small apartment, the photograph still trembling slightly between her fingers as the weight of everything she had tried to bury pressed back into the present, her eyes fixed on the image as if looking long. Enough might somehow change what it meant, but nothing about it had changed, not the way Alexander had looked at her that night, not the quiet certainty in his expression that made her believe, even if only for a moment, that she had found something real, something lasting, and yet reality had proven otherwise. And now that same man was closer than ever to uncovering the truth she had hidden. And as she carefully placed the photograph and the document back into the envelope, her movements slow and deliberate, she knew she could not stay here, not even for one more night. Because the moment he connected the pieces, everything would unravel, and she could not allow that to happen, not when there was more at stake than just her past. And as she moved quickly toward the small bedroom, pulling open a drawer and gathering the few essentials she had, her mind racing through the next steps, she paused only briefly when she felt a sudden, gentle movement from the baby, a quiet reminder that every decision she made now carried more weight than ever before. And she placed her hand over her stomach, her voice soft but steady as she whispered that they would be okay, even though she was not entirely sure how, because starting over again would not be easy, but it was necessary. And just as she reached for her bag, a sound echoed faintly through the hallway outside, footsteps, slow and deliberate, causing her entire body to tense as instinct took over, her breath catching as she turned toward the door, every sense suddenly heightened. Because deep down she already knew there was only one person who would follow this trail this quickly, one person who would not stop until he found what he was looking for. And at that exact moment, just outside the building, Alexander Reed stepped through the front entrance, his presence commanding even in the worn, quiet space as his eyes scanned the dim hallway with sharp precision, taking in every detail, every closed door, every flicker of light. And something inside him shifted again, stronger this time, as if he was not just searching for answers anymore, but being pulled toward them, guided by something he could not fully explain. And as he moved toward the staircase, his footsteps steady and controlled, the memory that had been forming in fragments began to align more clearly, the sound of her voice, the way she had said his name, not with hesitation or fear, but with familiarity, with something deeper that he had dismissed at the time but could no longer ignore. And as he reached the second floor, stopping briefly at the top of the stairs, his gaze moving down the narrow corridor, he felt it, a certainty he rarely questioned. She was here, and just on the other side of one of those doors, Emily stood frozen in place, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain it could be heard through the walls, her mind racing between the instinct to run and the knowledge that it might already be too late. Because some truths, no matter how carefully hidden, had a way of finding their way back, and now the distance between them had disappeared completely, leaving only a single moment standing between what was hidden and what was about to be revealed. The silence in the hallway felt heavier with every second as Emily stood just inches from the door, her hand hovering near the handle but not moving, her breath shallow, controlled, as if even the smallest sound might give her away. While on the other side Alexander Reed moved slowly down the corridor, his footsteps measured, deliberate, each one echoing faintly against the worn floor as his gaze fixed on the final door at the end, something inside him pulling him forward with a certainty he could no longer ignore, because the closer he got, the stronger the feeling became, not just recognition, but something deeper, something unresolved. And when he finally stopped in front of the door, the world seemed to pause, the noise of the city outside fading into nothing as he raised his hand and knocked once, firm but controlled, the sound cutting through the quiet space like a signal that could not be taken back. And inside, Emily closed her eyes tightly for a brief moment, her heart racing as the reality of the situation settled in. There was no more time, no more space to run, and slowly, with a steady breath, she reached for the handle and opened the door just enough to face him, her expression calm but guarded, even as everything inside her felt anything but. And the moment their eyes met, something shifted instantly, the tension between them no longer subtle but undeniable, because this was not the same distance they had before. This was direct, unavoidable, and Alexander did not speak right away, his gaze moving over her face as if searching for something specific, something just out of reach. And then, almost quietly, he said, "That is not your real name." His voice low but certain, not a question, not a guess, but a conclusion, and Emily held his gaze for a moment longer before answering, her voice steady despite the pressure building around them. "It is the name I use now." And something in that response only confirmed what he already suspected. his jaw tightening slightly as another piece of the memory locked into place, the tone of her voice. The way she stood her ground even now. And without stepping back, he asked the question that had been forming since the moment he saw her again. Who are you? And for a second, the silence stretched between them, heavy, charged, filled with everything neither of them had said, and Emily felt it, the pull of the truth pressing against her, the urge to end it here, to tell him everything and let the past finally surface. But as her hand instinctively moved to her stomach, she made her choice, her eyes softening just slightly as she shook her head. Someone you do not need to find. And she began to close the door, but Alexander reacted instantly, not forcefully, but with enough presence to stop it, his hand resting against the edge as his voice dropped even lower, more intense now. I remember you. And those 4 words changed everything, because they were not spoken with uncertainty. They carried weight, recognition, and something dangerously close to regret, and Emily froze, her breath catching as the barrier she had built for years began to crack in that single moment. Because if he remembered, even partially, then it was only a matter of time before everything came back. And as she looked at him again, truly looked this time, she saw it in his eyes, not just determination, but confusion, and beneath that, something else, something she had not expected to see again. And for the first time since he knocked on the door, doubt crept into her resolve, because the past she had been running from was no longer behind her. It was standing right in front of her, asking questions she might not be able to keep avoiding. The words lingered in the narrow space between them, heavy and impossible to ignore, as Emily felt her grip on the present begin to slip under the weight of what he had just said, because those 4 words were not supposed to happen, not now, not like this. And yet the certainty in Alexander's voice made it clear that something had already broken through the barrier she had spent years building, and as she stood there, her hand still resting lightly against the door, she realized that the situation had shifted beyond her control, because if he truly remembered, even fragments, then the truth was no longer something she could simply walk away from. And Alexander did not move, his hand still steady against the door as his eyes searched hers with a focus that was no longer detached or analytical, but personal, as if he was trying to connect the woman standing in front of him with the memory forming in his mind. And slowly, almost cautiously, he spoke again. The night by the ocean. His voice quieter now, less certain but more deliberate. You said you would leave before things became complicated. And the moment those words reached her, Emily felt the past crash into the present with a force she could not deny, her breath catching as the memory he described aligned perfectly with the one she had tried to bury, and for a brief second, her composure faltered, the emotion she had kept contained slipping into her expression before she could stop it. And that was all Alexander needed to see, because in that single reaction, everything shifted for him. The doubt, the uncertainty, it all began to solidify into something real, and his voice lowered further, almost as if he was speaking more to himself than to her. You are her. And it was not a question, it was recognition finally taking shape, and Emily closed her eyes. Briefly, knowing that denying it further would only delay what was already unfolding, but admitting it would change everything. And as she opened her eyes again, meeting his gaze with a quiet steadiness, she spoke carefully, choosing each word with intention. That was a long time ago, and while it was not a direct confirmation, it was enough to bridge the gap between memory and reality, enough to confirm that the connection he felt was not imagined. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching as the weight of that realization settled in, until Alexander's gaze shifted slightly, drawn almost instinctively to the movement of her hand as it rested protectively over her stomach, and something in his expression changed again, sharper now, more focused, because this was not part of the memory he had been piecing together. This was new, unexpected, and the question that followed came without hesitation. How far along are you? And Emily's entire body tensed. At the shift, the conversation moving into territory she had been determined to avoid, her instinct immediately pushing her to step back, to create distance. But the space between them was already too narrow, the truth too close, and she hesitated just long enough for the silence to become its own answer, and Alexander saw it. Not just the hesitation, but the meaning behind it. And in that moment, A new realization began to form, one that carried far more weight than anything before, because the timing, the connection, the fact that she had appeared in his life now, it all pointed toward a possibility he could not ignore. And as his gaze returned to hers, more intense than before, the question he asked next was quieter, but far more significant. Is it mine? And the air between them seemed to still completely as those words settled, because this was no longer about the past alone. This was about something that could define the future, and Emily felt the impact of that question in a way she had been trying to avoid from the very beginning, her mind racing, her heart pulling in two directions at once, because the answer she carried had the power to change everything, and once spoken, it could never be taken back. The question hung in the air with a weight neither of them could ignore, and for a moment, everything seemed to slow, the distant sounds of the city fading into nothing as Emily stood there, her hand instinctively tightening over her stomach, her heart racing as the truth she had carried alone for so long pressed against her chest, demanding to be acknowledged. But fear held it back. Fear of what would happen if she said it out loud. Fear of how everything would change the second those words left her lips, and across from her, Alexander Reed did not look away, his gaze fixed on her with an intensity that was no longer just about answers. It was about understanding something that had already begun to shift inside him, because the possibility he had just spoken could not be undone, and the silence between them stretched longer than either expected, until finally Emily took a slow breath, steadying herself, her voice quiet but firm as she answered, "You do not get to ask that question." Like it is simple, and the words were not denial, but they were not confirmation either. They were a boundary, one she had every right to set, and for the first time since he arrived, something in Alexander's expression softened, just slightly, as if he recognized the weight behind her response, the reality that this was not something he could control with logic or demand with authority, and yet he did not step back, because walking away now was no longer an option, not when everything in front of him pointed to a truth he had missed years ago, and his voice, when he spoke again, was lower, less commanding, but no less determined. "Then help me understand." And there was something different in the way he said it, something that carried less assumption and more intention, and Emily felt it. The shift, subtle but real, and for a moment, she hesitated, caught between the instinct to protect herself and the growing realization that the past was no longer something she could outrun. Because he had already found her, already remembered enough to start connecting the pieces. And if she continued to run, she would spend the rest of her life looking over her shoulder, waiting for the moment he caught up again. And slowly, she lowered her gaze, her hand moving gently across her stomach as if grounding herself in the present before she spoke. 6 months, she said quietly, the number settling between them with immediate significance, because it aligned too closely with the timeline he had just begun to recall, and Alexander felt it instantly. The confirmation not spoken directly but impossible to ignore, his mind calculating even as something deeper, something far less controlled, began to take hold, because this was no longer just a question of identity. This was something far more personal, far more irreversible, and as his eyes lifted back to hers, the certainty in them had changed, no longer searching, but understanding, and that shift alone made Emily's breath catch, because she saw it, the moment he realized what she had been trying so hard to keep hidden, and everything inside her told her to step back, to close the door, to end this, before it went any further. But her feet did not move, because some part of her knew that this moment, this exact point in time, was the one she had been avoiding since the day she walked away from him years ago, and now it was here, undeniable and unchangeable. And as the silence settled once more, heavier than before, Alexander spoke again, his voice quieter but carrying a weight it had never held before. "You should have told me." And the words were not accusatory, they were something else. Entirely, something closer to regret, and that single shift changed the dynamic between them in a way neither had expected, because for the first time, this was not about power or control, it was about consequence. And Emily met his gaze once more, her expression no longer guarded in the same way, but still firm as she answered, "You would not have listened." And there was no anger in her voice, only truth. And that truth lingered between them as both of them stood there, realizing that Everything they thought they understood about the past was only part of a much larger story, one that had yet to fully unfold, and now that the truth had begun to surface, there was no going back, only forward, into whatever came next.